Arguably, the most important part of your story is the start of it. This is where we are going to first get our reader's attention and be sort of the first impression, while also setting the tone for the rest of your story and acting as the hook for our audience. And here's the thing. Personally, I love writing intros and I love writing those first pages. I think there's a lot of pressure we often have when it comes to these initial pages, or when it comes to that first chapter. It's sometimes the ones that we spend the most time on, especially if we are preparing them for submission to a literary agent or some other kind of publisher. In my time as a writer and as an editor and as a writing coach, I have seen a lot of opening pages and I've seen a lot of first pages. Often these are the first that, of course, we see or show to either critique partners or to an editor. And through seeing all of these different pages and writing a fair amount myself, I've come up with a couple of principles, or at least a couple of guiding techniques that we can use to not just make those first pages effective, but also make those first pages impactful. And this really goes beyond any sort of genre or age group. There will be, of course, some exceptions to some of these principles, but for the most part, these really help in creating a killer opening. Welcome back to the Wrestling with Words podcast. My name's Cameron. I'm a writer, an editor, and your host. Here, we talk about all things related to writing and storytelling, and the goal is to help you tell better stories while also understanding how the best stories are told. The idea for today's video and for some that I'm going to be making in the future came from a recent poll that I did on the community tab. I asked what are some of the more interesting things that you all are interested in hearing about, and one of those things was pacing. But I think it's hard to jump right into pacing an entire story without first understanding how to pace an opening and then also how to pace a scene. So some of these techniques and some of these writing elements will help you in approaching either a scene, but also should help you in pacing out that first opening that you have. I believe that this saying or this phrase came from the book Making Shapely Fiction by Jerome Stern. In short, what this is saying is that there needs to be a problem, and it needs to be urgent, and it needs to be something that our characters should be taking action on immediately. The way that I believe it's described in the book is that there should be conflict at the start of your story. It should be big in the eyes of your character, and it should be pressing. This is really a good principle to have for not just your opening, but also for key and even high tension moments throughout your story. Sometimes we often spend a lot of time building up to a climactic moment where we might have been better off just starting right at the start of that climactic moment. And this is also a good principle to have for our problems that our characters face. They should be apparent, right? If there's a bear at our front door, that's a pretty big problem that anybody can really identify with. We can understand why the person is seeing the bear there as being an issue. Same thing goes for the conflict in our story. This should be big and pressing, especially in the context and in the eyes of our character. The reader should understand why that thing is an issue, why it is urgent, and why it is there in the first place. If you're getting value out of today's video, please consider liking and even subscribing. It'll help the channel out a lot, and it's a good way for me to know what topics are helpful and help me understand what topics I should talk about in the future. And kind of dovetailing off of the first point about a bear being sort of at the door, this is also a principle that we can use on a scene level as well. Especially though, at the start of our story, we really do want to avoid lengthy intros. We want to avoid the sort of meandering and setting up that might be your first idea at the intro. The normal world, of course, is something to be established, but we don't want to spend a lot of time on this. We want to get to some of the most important information and really sort of get to the conflict. Getting in late and leaving early, especially with the emphasis on getting in late, we want to start the story at the moment right before that conflict is first going to kick off. This can often be a great hook and a great way to sort of establish the tone and the sort of conflict that you might have throughout the rest of your story to the reader or your audience. The time that we should be spending right before that conflict is time to get invested in the character. We don't necessarily need to know their backstory at this point, but it will be important to understand who they are and why the reader might care about them. And in addition to that, we want to sort of finish the scene earlier than you usually would think. If there is some big conflict in our first chapter, we probably want to end it right at that. We don't really want to show that trailing resolution. We want to use that as an incentive to continue reading the story. We don't really need to know exactly what happens next. We can save that, or it can be almost implied. This can be something that is misleading, or we can then add a twist that might be an unexpected resolution to whatever the conflict was that the character was combating against. And a nice pattern to establish sort of that pacing or even get a rhythm to your story is to continue this pattern from chapter to chapter. This is really beneficial and a useful technique, especially if you have multiple point of view characters. Having to sort of restart and give all the background and build up to some moment within each chapter thereafter can slow your pacing down. However, if we take the principle of getting in late and leaving early, this can be something that really grips and pulls our reader or our audience throughout the rest of our story. There can be little bits of resolution that might come up in each sequential chapter, but the idea that we want to sort of end that resolution early and then lead right into the next conflict is something that becomes even addicting to find out what happens next. And like I said, this is a principle that we can sort of use throughout our story. And it should be also noted that continuing this sort of roller coaster of high tension and low tension is what we are essentially doing. Except in this case, the valleys of low tension are usually a lot less deep. But that does go to say that sometimes having too much of this starting late and getting out early can sometimes be a little bit exhausting. And sometimes there are moments or brief moments scattered throughout where we give a bit more of a release. This will also depend sort of on the genre of whatever your story is. If your story is a gripping thriller, then usually there's going to be this sort of throttling of high tension, very little release, and then continue that high tension. But if we're writing something else, then maybe we can ebb and flow a little bit more, letting there be moments of very, very high tension with very little resolution, where then at some point we give a bit more or a bit longer of a space for our audience to breathe. This is something that I've sort of adapted as my own personal writing technique, or something that I know that I do. And this might fit for your own prose or your own writing style, and it might not. But this idea of closing a circle is something that I find almost rewarding, in a sense that when the reader is starting at a certain place and we are ending, echoing sort of that same idea, it can feel as if there is some kind of arc or payoff that we have given the audience. Now, this is something that I do a lot with short stories, but also the way that I kind of write my longer form work as well is structured in the case of thinking of each chapter like a short story. So this is something that I use on a shorter scale or on a smaller scale, but also I use this sometimes for my chapters as well. But the way that this sort of works is that it can be either we usually are going to start a scene or a chapter with a certain emotion or a certain line or with a certain theme or even emotional beat. Then what we can do is we can end that same chapter or scene with that same beat, emotional line, or line of dialogue, essentially closing this circle or coming full circle on where we started. Sometimes this is something that's seen more of like a flat arc, but this could also be in reference to a character discovering the truth about something else. Say that they read something from a journal, and throughout the course of that chapter, they understand a little bit better and have a deeper meaning of whatever that thing is that they read in that journal, thus closing the chapter or the scene with reading that same line, but with an elevated level of understanding. This is something that I did for one of my short stories, Static Love, which you can read down below. But the idea was that I was ending and starting the story on this same line that the character in this case was acknowledging about themselves. In my short story, Static Love, it goes, "This is my favorite part. I've always been a sucker for falling in love." Where that same line, it ends the story as, "This is my favorite part. I've always been a sucker for falling in love." Where this sort of echoes a deeper understanding of the protagonist in this case. Something else that this kind of does, or that I found this does, is that it really does sort of set the tone for what sort of payoff and what sort of arc you are capable at fulfilling. Now, of course, the opening arc or the opening thematic arc that you might have for your first chapter probably and might not be the same tone or even the same one that the rest of your story will have. However, what this does is this signals to the reader, or the audience in this case, that you are capable at delivering and fulfilling some sort of promise that you might have made. But like I said, this is something that I've sort of developed that you can play around with. This isn't necessarily a principle that you need to live and die by for your opening. This is something that might fit to your story and it might not. And now I'll sort of talk about just very briefly some of the things or some of the biggest problems that I often see when it comes to a intro or an opening sort of set of pages. And some of these will just be sort of the antithesis or echoing some elements of the points that I've already made, but I think it's kind of worth saying here. The first thing is we don't want to be too lengthy. And being too lengthy is something that will not just hurt our first pages or our introduction, but if we are too lengthy in the rest of our story or with the rest of our scenes, the pacing will also be a bit screwed up as well. This can make the feeling of that we are dragging the story out or that it is unnecessarily longer than it needs to be. Another thing that was briefly hinted at, but adding too much of the normal world. This usually then echoes or is a symptom of not having enough conflict at the start of our story. And if we find ourselves building out backstory and spending a lot of time setting up the conflict that might be taking place in those first few pages, then we might want to revisit where we are starting our story. This is usually also a symptom of the fact that we aren't starting the story where it should be starting. The story should be starting somewhere around that initial conflict, and we should be starting as close to that conflict as possible. And another one that sort of strays away from a lot of the other points that I had made already, but having too many characters can often be really distracting. The big thing that we want to do is we want to keep our cast nice and small, especially for this opening. Having too many characters all being introduced and playing some kind of role is distracting and can be confusing. There are exceptions, of course. I'm sure this has been done plenty of times, but we want to make sure that we are introducing the core cast, or at least the core players that will carry us through at least this first initial part of our story. Having too many characters often is pulling away the attention who we should be giving our attention to as the audience. Not knowing who to focus on, who's important, will hurt the emotional investment that we are trying to build with these different characters. Make sure that we have our cast of characters condensed and focused. We can always build out our cast as the story goes on, but especially for these opening chapters, we should really only know who the major players are. But let me know what you're wrestling with. This, again, was a idea or a topic idea that sort of came from those community polls that I do. I'll be sure to do some more in the future, but feel free to also let me know some of the things that you are either struggling with or wrestling with yourself. I try to reply to every comment and get back to everybody. So be sure to let me know how your writing is going and some of the things that you are struggling with or would like to see a topic on in the future. But that's all to say. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.